All right, everybody ready to start?
Yeah.
That's good. I'll let everybody in then. Um, how can I let? Do you see them, Shiv? Maybe you see them, all the attendees too.
Yeah, the list is going up. It's now having 31.
Uh, for some reason, I can't let them in, but I think because I
They're
just
already
take
in.
left.
They're already in.
Yeah, but then aren't they? Okay, yeah, so they're
They're
listening to us.
in.
I
They're
see.
in. Mhm.
Okay, sorry about that for the heat, but I thought like we needed to get them in.
Okay. Shall we make a start? Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. My name's Shivit Bakrania. I'm a senior evaluation synthesis specialist at UNDP, as well as a co-chair of the United Nations Evaluation Group Synthesis Working Group and part of the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition Secretariat. I'm very pleased that you're all here today, and I'm very pleased to chair today's joint session between the Alliance for Living Evidence, or ALIVE, and the United Nations Evaluation Group's Evaluation Synthesis Working Group. So today's session, we're going to be looking at living evidence in practice, connecting synthesis, decision-making, and evaluation systems. So this session is part of the G-Local Evaluation Week, and it brings together two communities that are working together on closely related challenges. So on one side, we have the living evidence community, who's asking how evidence can be kept current, useful, and responsive to decision makers. And on the other side, we have the evaluation and evaluation synthesis community, looking to how we can make better use of the large body of evaluations we have that are being generated across the UN and other multilateral organizations. So we'll go into living synthesis as we go on, and we have excellent speakers to talk to that. But just to say a few words on this, the basic premise behind living evidence is simple but important. Evidence should not be treated as a static product that is produced once and then gradually becomes outdated. In many areas, the evidence needs to be continuously identified, appraised, synthesized, and updated so that decision makers can work with the best available knowledge at the time they need it. For the UN evaluation system, these questions are really relevant. The UN produces a large volume of evaluations and evidence, but this is often spread across different repositories, uses different terminology, and is not always easy to synthesize or update. And similar challenges are faced across governments, research institutions, NGOs, development agencies, and evidence intermediaries worldwide. So there are shared challenges across the wider global evidence system. And today's conversation is not only about bringing living evidence into evaluation or evaluation into living evidence, it's about what these communities can learn from each other. So just to go over the agenda, I've done the welcome by the chair, just me, and we'll have some excellent presentations from Professor Ruth Stewart and Ja-Eun Lee. And we'll have a panel discussion from the Live Learning Forum co-chairs, and I'll introduce them in a second. And then finally, we'll move on to question and answers for the audience to participate and interact. Next slide, please. So just a few practical notes. Previous slide. Just a few practical notes. So the session is being recorded. I hope everyone is okay with that. Translation is available through Wordly, and I believe there's a Wordly link provided where you can select your preferred language. And we also encourage you to use the chat and the Q&A function during the session, and we'll come to those questions at the Q&A segment of the session today. Next slide, please. So we have some fantastic speakers today. First, we have Professor Ruth Stewart. who's the director for the Alliance for Living Evidence at the Future Evidence Foundation. Ruth has worked for many years at the interface of evidence, policy, and decision-making, with a strong focus on making evidence useful, accessible, and used in practice. So Ruth will introduce Alive and the Alive Learning Forum and share some reflections from the forum's first year. And we have Ja-Eun Lee, who's our second speaker, who's an evaluation officer at the International Labour Organization in Geneva. Her work focuses on synthesis, AI-enabled evaluation, and data-driven decision-making. At ILO, she's been leading initiatives that use automation, dashboards, and AI-supported tools. She's a co-chair, a fellow co-chair of the UNEG Evaluation Synthesis Working Group, and she'll speak about living evidence from the perspective of UN evaluation synthesis, and we'll also share some examples of ILO's work. We also have an excellent set of panelists who are representing the Alive Learning Forum and the co-chairs of that forum. So firstly, we have Rasha Fadala, who's a senior policy advisor at the Knowledge to Policy Center at the American University of Beirut, who has extensive experience in evidence-informed policymaking and systematic review approaches. We also have Daniela Garcia Villamil, who's an independent researcher and consultant working across evidence, policy, and learning spaces. We also have Fermia Bogale, who's a public health researcher at the Ethiopian Public Health Institute, bringing experience from national and regional evidence systems. And we have Josephine Watera, who's an assistant director for research services at the Parliament of Uganda, bringing an important perspective on evidence within parliamentary and decision-making institutions. Okay, so I hope I did all of your bios justice, and if I didn't, please come in when you speak. I'm sure you'll all agree we have a fantastic set of speakers and panelists, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what they have to share with us. And with that, I'll stop the welcome and introductions and hand over to you, Ruth.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the warm welcome. It's great to be here and to see so many participants from all around the world joining us today. If you could take me through to the next slide, please, Christian. And I'll ask you to help me build it up. So before I tell you a little bit more about the Alive approach and how we're using it to drive impact, I just wanted to give you this little definition at the bottom of the screen here about how, when we're talking about living evidence, we're talking about evidence that's continuously identified and synthesized and updated. And it's living not just to keep pace with the knowledge, the research, the new evidence that's coming out, but also to respond to rapidly evolving needs and priorities, as well as knowledge and the decisions that need to be made. So if you click one more time, I'm going to show you a little bit about the approach that we've developed and how it's come about. So for many, many years, I've been working, and I'm sure many of you have as well, to try and ensure that evidence that we produce meets the needs of decision makers. And sometimes I did that by producing systematic reviews that are published in libraries, and I hope somebody's going to read them. And sometimes I've done that working really closely with government colleagues in South Africa and other countries on the continent to try and understand the needs of decision makers and make sure we could respond. But often that work meant not finding a systematic review that answered their question, instead doing a rapid review or pulling together whatever I could find that I thought might be helpful at the highest quality available to provide to decision makers in the timeliness that they needed. What's exciting about the work that we're doing in Alive is that we're trying to meet those needs of decision makers, often very broad, not necessarily answered by an existing systematic review, in fact, almost never answered by an existing systematic review, and often very short timeframes. We need something for next week. There's no time to go out and commission a review. So we're trying to meet those needs, and we're trying to do it with the highest quality bar that we can, and we believe living evidence can help solve that. So we're working to build communities and relationships with decision makers who need evidence and to spend time listening to them, understanding what they need, and then building living evidence banks that meet their needs and using those to respond. So if you click once more, you'll see how we're trying to connect these two building blocks of our work. So we take decision makers' priorities to drive the generation and maintenance of living evidence banks that meet their needs. And then we're using those to serve decision makers. And this loop is a continuous cycle. So perhaps on a monthly basis, we're engaging with that decision-making community to understand their needs, generate evidence, and bring that evidence back to them. So it's a continuous process. And if you just do one more click, we've identified a number of characteristics of this approach. And this is where we're trying to lean in to evaluate to what extent this is helpful. So whilst we come from perhaps less of an evaluation background than our UN colleagues, our work engages with evaluation in two ways. One is in thinking about evaluating this process as a whole. And the other is in making sure that that living evidence bank at the bottom there includes evaluations and is not only defined by a particular definition of what counts as evidence. It often includes data as well as evaluations, grey literature, and published research. So if you can go through to the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what we've been doing over the last year or so. And one of the first things we've been doing, and you are, by the nature of joining this webinar, participating in this, we've been running a learning forum, been really trying to lean into this idea that we have to learn as we're going. And we've been facilitating this as a space where we can share and very much learn from others as well. It's been a global exchange for advancing living evidence from all sorts of different perspectives. And it's great to have the evaluation perspective and the UN perspective here with us today. It's an open access network, so people can participate in many different ways. And as you are, hopefully some of you are experiencing now, it's very much a multilingual and global environment with engagements at different time zones and in different languages and from different perspectives. If I could have the next slide, please. So we've also been reflecting on this as community and what we're learning as we go and thinking about these different characteristics. So how is the forum helping us as a learning function to think about both learning from and driving improvements in issues like equity and diversity and inclusion, and sharing and learning from one another in the best possible ways? And then as we've thought about the insights of our work, we've characterized them according to these key elements of the model. So how is the forum helping us to pull out insights about how we can be more efficient in how we generate evidence to meet decision makers' needs, and how we can be better at addressing those needs and really providing what's useful, in being more collaborative, in bringing equity to our work, and generating a dynamic process, not just in the way in which we're responding to decision makers' needs with evidence, but also in the way we're learning from one another and refining the approach as we go. If I could have the next slide, please. So one of the other pieces that you may be interested in, and I'm going to ask my colleague Christian to pop the link into the chat when he has a moment, but it's been to build a living evidence atlas. And this atlas brings together living evidence efforts from all around the world. It's an online resource. You can search and see what's being done where, in which sectors, what's current, and what's perhaps a living effort that has now been parked or archived for some reason. And we would love to hear from you if you're engaged in living evidence and you'd like to add your effort to this resource. We find that this is, since it was launched earlier this year, has really been used by the community and is really proving as a way of sharing not just our activities, but those of others. If I could have the next slide, please. So then I just want to share briefly just 2 slides on how the Future Evidence Foundation is working to actually try and deliver that approach as comprehensively as possible. So obviously thinking about how we can share what we're learning and share the ideas and learn from others as well. But we've also got, in particular, 2 significant programs running. One on vaccine delivery and driving HPV vaccine specifically. It's an area where there's a lot of evidence, where we know the vaccine works really well, but delivery of that vaccine is relatively poor across the world, not just in low resource settings, but even in high resource settings. So there's a gap. There's a kind of no-do gap. People sometimes talk about it. We've got the knowledge, but something's not happening. And so we've been using this approach to try and drive up vaccine delivery of HPV. The other area is in climate and health. And at that intersection, where we have a growing body of evidence around climate and climate change, and a huge body of evidence around health, and trying to work to bring that in more effective ways to decision makers. And as we've been delivering these two big programs, we've been learning a number of things across these same key characteristics of the approach. So when we think about our goal of driving equity through this work, it's still early days, right? So these partnerships have been running for around a year. But one of the biggest wins, it's been extremely difficult. So one of the lessons has been this is really challenging. But one of the big wins has been building really as inclusive, unusually inclusive communities of decision makers and other stakeholders to help to shape the evidence. So that box I showed you at the top, building those partnerships and building those trusted relationships. And we've really seen the inclusion of different leaders and decision makers who are usually excluded from those conversations into that space to help to shape the evidence that's generated. And just one little example from this week, we had a colleague who's a professor from the US who told us that an issue was not important. It's not important, he said, but actually we know because we're engaging with less usual suspects and really leaning into inclusion to make sure we're identifying the right priorities, that this is important to the communities that we're engaging with. So we know we've been facilitating greater inclusion in the work that we've been doing. And we've also been directing funding. So some of the funding, a large chunk of the funding that has come to Future Evidence to drive this work, we are deliberately redirecting to synthesis teams in low resource settings. And there's two reasons. One is equity in and of itself. And the other one is that these teams are helping us to generate the evidence in that bottom bank to answer the questions of decision makers. And we really believe that synthesis teams in low resource settings who understand the issues that we are trying to address in those reviews are better placed to conduct those systematic reviews than teams from perhaps the global north who have no direct exposure of the issues that we're trying to address. In terms of how we're working collaboratively, we've got 7 different partnerships. So that green box is replicated 7 different times. And I just ran a quick poll with my colleagues because these numbers change all the time. But in those 7 partnerships, we have over 200 individuals who are engaging and discussing their needs for evidence. And they come from over 100 organizations across 20 countries. So we really have some global partnerships that we're building. If I could have the next slide, and this is my last slide, just wanted to share a bit more learning about this work. So we've also been thinking about how dynamic and efficient are these processes? How can living evidence really bring that living characteristic to serve decision makers better? So one of them has been actually just more broadly working with organizations to start to engage with living synthesis methodologies. And then the other piece is directly in these partnerships. We're now beginning to build those evidence banks and to start to maintain them. So we have repositories that are being maintained and kept up to date. We have evidence maps that are being maintained and kept up to date. And we're now starting to produce living systematic reviews as well. So the first living systematic reviews should be out this month. And that will be a really exciting space. So it's early days, but we're beginning to see real results there. Of course, our ability to judge how useful these evidence banks are we're just on the edge of that. So we're just now beginning to share that evidence back with our decision makers and our communities. We know that their needs define the evidence, so they should be much more useful than the evidence that's currently out there. We have these big evidence maps on vaccines and on climate and health, and we have protocols that have been produced for 10 living systematic reviews. And just in the next few weeks, we'll start to present the findings of that evidence back to our communities. So overall, it's been really difficult. It's been challenging. Setting up of living evidence systems and living evidence communities has taken longer than we expect, but we're just now beginning to really see the benefits for the decision makers we're working with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Some great progress being made there, and a couple of things stood out for me from your presentation there. So the emphasis on living evidence as a partnership model and not just the technical method, and the importance of decision maker priorities driving the evidence work. So really important there. So I'm going to turn it over now to our second speaker, who is Ja-Eun Lee. Over to you, Ja-Eun.
Thanks, Shiv. I'll try to make this PowerPoint work first. This one.
It's coming. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. However, I cannot see it, so let me see. Okay, good. So good morning and afternoon, everyone. Today I'd like to share what living evidence looks like in a large international organization that produces hundreds of evaluations and needs to turn those evaluations into learning and decision making. I'll share some reflection from the UNIC Evaluation Synthesis Working Group that she just introduced in the beginning, and then show how the ILO is experimenting with the different approaches to make evaluation evidence more accessible, current, and useful. First, UNIC Evaluation Synthesis Working Group, Shiv already mentioned a little bit. This was established in 2022 because many UN agencies were facing a similar challenge. We are producing large volumes of evaluation evidence, but often struggling to bring that evidence together in ways that decision makers could actually use. This is a voluntary membership. We are providing a space to exchange experiences, develop guidance, and connect with the broader evidence synthesis community, including this webinar. We focus on credible, systematic, and transparent synthesis of UN evaluations, but also expand evidence sources such as academic articles and gray literature. One thing we've increasingly been discussing is this living evidence. Therefore, we'll add a chapter for living evidence for the existing UNIC synthesis guideline. Yeah, it's in the process, and we hope to get some support from Alive and this community. So this brings me to the opportunities and challenges. She already mentioned challenges a little bit in the beginning, so I'll focus on opportunities. We already have an enormous evidence base, so the question is whether we can make it more accessible and then update and use it more effectively, particularly for decision makers, including governing bodies and program teams and country offices. A range of digital tools is supporting this shift, including, the evidence repositories, dashboards, et cetera, et cetera. However, the transition raises a number of important methodological and institutional questions. Yeah, it definitely requires governance arrangements, quality assurance mechanisms, sustainable resourcing, and a clear understanding of how evidence will be used in decision-making processes. Now, a quick introduction to the ILO, my organization, because I'm going to share our experience within my organization. The ILO was established in 1919 and has a mandate to promote the social justice and decent work. What makes us unique within the UN system is our tripartite structure. This is only UN organization which has this structure. So government, employers, and workers all have a voice in governance and decision-making at the ILO. We work globally through labor standards, policy advice, and development cooperation programs. As a result, we generate significant amount of evaluation evidence every year. So I'll just quickly introduce the living evidence ecosystem within the ILO. Historically, our synthesis process looked something like this. We create evaluation reports. We hire an expert synthesizing evaluation reports annual basis, and the findings were reported periodically to decision makers. This model still has a value. However, it can struggle to keep pace with the evolving information needs. What we are now trying to build is more of an evidence ecosystem First, evaluation first feed into a repository, which is called iEval Discovery. The repository feeds into different living evidence products. Those products serve different users. So instead of a single report annually, we have multiple entry points into the evidence, and I'll briefly show 2 examples. So the first is a Power BI dashboard. The dashboard builds on established meta-analysis methodology. So this is already this already exists. Evaluation reports are assessed against a score matrix consisting of 29 indicators covering key performance dimensions. This is currently done by a consultant. However, we are also exploring the option to make this process much more efficient using AI. And then the assessment results are entered electronically and automatically integrated into the dashboard through an API connection. So this creates a continuous flow from evaluation reports to synthesis data and to visualization. I plan to have a demonstration, but I will just put all the demonstrations in the end if we have a time. But basically, this dashboard allows users explore evaluation findings very dynamically. They can look at trends across regions, themes, outcomes, or intervention types, and obtain an immediate overview of the evidence. The second example is our AI-powered synthesis assistant. The tool allows users to search across more than 1,700 ILO evaluation reports using natural language questions. The search only includes this repository, doesn't go outside, so to prevent any hallucination or misleading information. Instead of manually reviewing multiple documents, users can quickly identify relevant findings, lessons, and recommendations, and also provides a source-cited responses, allowing users to trace information back to the original evaluation reports to ensure trust in the synthesis provided. However, we view the tool as a complement to evaluative judgment rather than a replacement for it. Interpretation and decision-making still require human expertise. Unfortunately, it's only open to ILOs that we do not have enough funding source to open it to the public. So I just want to make that connection of this living evidence to decision making. Ruth already discussed about this. The value of living evidence really depends on whether it supports better decision. And one lesson we have learned is that different users have a very different evidence needs and prefer the template or format. For example, the governing body is interested in strategic oversight and organizational performance, and they just meet a few times per year. Therefore, the annual meta-analysis report we've been producing many years is still very valuable. However, program colleagues need evidence to support program and budget monitoring more rapidly. And this is where the dashboard and AI assistant supports the best. The same goes for country offices and project managers, and we try to tailor our living evidence to their needs. So our experience has highlighted 4 key challenges. I think based on what Ruth presented, it looks like, Alive has multiple years of experience of creating this living evidence. This is a quite new area for us. So first, the first lesson learned is adoption. Like developing tool is often easier than encouraging people to change how they access and use evidence. And the second is quality assurance. It requires continuous attention to data quality, also, standardized metadata and the validation of AI generated outputs. Third is sustainability. Living evidence system requires ongoing maintenance, therefore resources and technical support, which is quite getting harder and harder given the funding environment within the UN. Finally, the governance. The organization need a clear ownership, agreed standards, and transparent processes for updating evidence. And then we also need to communicate that changes. Just so quickly, this is the last one. So we're continuing to explore how living evidence approaches can strengthen organizational learning. So one area is living evidence gap map. So Ruth already presented a living evidence gap map of a live, so I think we can learn from that experience. We are also interested in strengthening institutional learning system and creating stronger links between evaluation evidence and decision-making processes. Looking beyond the ILO, there is significant potential for greater interoperability and knowledge sharing across UN organizations, of course, with bigger communities, and of course, continuous evidence monitoring for SDG reporting. That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ja-Eun. That was a really helpful bridge, I think, between the living evidence agenda and some of the practical realities in the UN evaluation system, both across organizations and for the ILO specifically. So thank you. So I think now we're going to move into the panel discussion. And the purpose is really to open up conversation across different perspectives here represented by the different panel members. So evidence partnerships, evaluation synthesis, policy use, regional evidence ecosystems, and parliamentary evidence use as well. So I'm going to invite the panelists to answer some questions that I'm going to pose, okay? And the first question is really about how we go about embedding a living evidence approach. And I'm going to ask this question here. So to what extent can decision makers be better served by using syntheses that are living? And I wondered, Fermia, if you could open up on that and see if you have some comments on that question. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Shiv. So this is a very important question because, we are in the space where we are almost exploring what the capacity and the extent of living synthesis can go to as opposed to decision making. And just now we've heard, and of course, it's also the reality of everyone these days that things are really changing rapidly in the different spaces that we are, whether we see it in the areas that are related with SDG or in the spaces that we're working in the ILO that was mentioned just now. In every space that we look into, decisions are needed in a very rapid and changing environment. And I think this is where the living syntheses approach, and we call it a model as well, has the greatest strength in it. Sorry, because as you've seen in the presentation from Ruth as well, this is a space or an approach that we're trying to connect decision makers who need evidence and us trying to provide a living evidence that meets that need. And this process allows us to provide, I believe, the confidence that the recommendations that we're providing through the evidence, the conclusions that are going to be made based on an evidence that is updated over time is based on not only the best available evidence, which is a term that we usually use in the evidence-informed decision making, not only the best available evidence, but now with the living aspect of it, we are adding on the latest best available evidence. And I think this is one of the critical questions that we have been having from decision makers over the past years. And again, this aspect really becomes very important in the context of different programs and also policies that are changing and that need to be adapted over time. And us as a community, as evidence synthesizers, evaluators, we need to provide that support of adaptive decision makers for our decision or policy makers. And the living evidence or the living synthesis model really helps us to sort of bridge the gap, or at least reduce the gap that we have between evidence generation and evidence utilization. And again, beyond the methodology that we provide through this synthesis, in every EIDM space, be it a knowledge translation space, be it an evaluation synthesis, one of the main things when you think about serving decision makers is really bringing about engagement of decision makers. And without the engagement, without trying to understand decision makers and their needs, the provision of product is not going to make any difference. And here is, again, another aspect of living evidence as an approach really necessitates us to have the engagement of decision makers in an ongoing manner. And it's not going to be, engaging decision makers maybe at the beginning of a project, then talking to them at the end of the project when you have a product. So this is not going to work in the living evidence as the name indicates by its own. Now it's a process of engaging decision makers and keeping them remain connected throughout the process of monitoring the evidence as they come up. So I think ultimately the value of having living syntheses, I think, comes in allowing decision makers not only to have the product, but allowing them to understand when evidence is coming up and what kind of evidence is really coming up and what those evidence really mean for the decision and the action that they are going to pass on. So just to sum it up, I would say that decision makers will be served through this living evidence and living synthesis process across engagement, across ensuring that they are informed and ensuring that the evidence that we're providing them is relevant, timely, and evident, in real time. So I would say this is one of the approach that we're still navigating, but these are some of the real advantages that we're seeing as opposed to, providing them with real-time evidence. Over to you, Shi.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we are still navigating this, but we see massive potential. I wanted to ask the same question to Josephine. Josephine, you work very closely with decision makers and parliamentarians, so I'm sure you have some interesting perspectives on this question. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the presenters. And I think Fermia has done me well. She has laid a good ground. So we work in a space that is dealing with a lot of uncertainty, sporadic changes, too many things happening concurrently. While you're still dealing with this, the other one is happening. And so this space of living evidence gives us that opportunity to allow our decision makers, and in this context, I'll touch a little bit about Parliament, not to just have evidence for decisions, but evidence throughout decision, so that as things keep emerging, we can be able to quickly intervene with updated, evidence that can be relied on. In the context of Parliament, we have the responsibility of representing the people. The representation mandate requires a lot of citizen involvement and engagement. And living evidence gives us this opportunity to see that the citizens' voices, the citizens' expectations, the citizens' concerns are actually on the table at the right time when it is actually needed. When you look at other processes that require amending laws, when you look at other processes that require passing budgets, we cannot just rely on a report and say, last year we did a nice report. It's available on the platform. It's available on our website. That is not sufficient. There are things that have already shifted ground. When you look at 2-3 days of things that are happening around our community, you're dealing with climate change, you're dealing with, disease and emergencies, all these kind of crises that we are seeing, and now we have the era of AI. There's a lot that needs to be quickly addressed, And we cannot start looking at reports of last year, reports of the other year, but what is now or available on our table. So the living evidence space gives us a challenge to ask ourselves, are we catching up with the time when the decisions are needed? Because members of parliament are not going to wait for you tomorrow. So if you get in the report or the policy brief when the decision has already been taken, then you have actually wasted time and resources. So the challenge with us on the table as regards to living evidence is saying, like Fermia has mentioned, an aspect of engagement, an opportunity for co-creation. And even why co-creation matters is it provides ownership, that when a decision has been arrived at, we can all say we were part of this journey. And when you look at committees of parliament, they bring together people from different backgrounds. By the time a committee is put together, there are issues that they are mandated to address, but also different people that are constituting this committee. So living evidence gives that opportunity for every other person to bring their perspectives and say, I think this is how this should be done. I think the other one, this is how it should be done. So by the time a decision is being made, it's concrete, it's sustainable, and we're sure that it can actually transform our community. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Josephine. Yeah, living evidence is a vehicle for co-production. I think that's an important message. I'm going to hand it over to Daniela, the same question. I'm sure you have another useful perspective on this. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Shivit, and hello to everyone who's in the room. It's a pleasure for me to be sharing this space with you today. I wanted to particularly focus on this question because I recently concluded a collaboration with Southern Voice on how researchers and funders could enhance evidence use. So what practices, strategies, and choices from their end would foster evidence use in practice. And something that emerged from that initiative is that once there are already incentives in place to prioritize evidence use and implementation, a lot of additional work becomes necessary. So convening the right people, building multidisciplinary teams, engaging focal points from decision maker or user communities, mapping the evidence ecosystem in the specific context you're working on, seeking ways to build upon what is already there, what exists already, aligning with local realities, co-creating, tailoring outputs. So there's a lot of extra labor and time, especially in relational and coordination work, that goes far beyond the research or the synthesis process itself or the technical work. Now, while that initiative was focused on the researchers and funder side, decision makers and evidence users are also involved in the same process. So they are part of building a shared understanding, harmonizing terms, guidelines, documentation, and maintaining these relationships. And that, put together with the fact that they are often more limited not by a lack of research or information or data, but rather by the abundance of it, and the fact that it is disconnected, sometimes inconsistent, and often lacks a shared language, makes it clear that this coordination, alignment, facilitation work is actually central to whether evidence use is actually used at all. And I would say that this is very familiar in evaluation practice, sort of what Ja-Eun was mentioning just before in her presentation, where multiple studies, reports, assessments can coexist without being integrated into some coherent evidence base that truly supports decision making. And this is exactly where I think living synthesis becomes interesting for decision makers. So what emerges for me is that living synthesis generally, but also in the evaluation community, can serve decision makers better, because once an initial baseline is established, the work of updating becomes far less demanding, not only technically, but also relationally. So once there are shared guidelines, common language, agreed standards in place, living systems can reduce a lot of the noise coming from disconnected information, disconnected teams, disconnected ways of working. And then the very fact of being able to trace how that knowledge itself evolves over time can add a very valuable nuance to decision-making in specific moments or contexts. So I think that just as an overall overarching thought, it is not simply to me that living evidence or living synthesis, for example, in the evaluation community, keeps evidence and knowledge updated, relevant, and timely, but it's also that it helps preserve and build upon the relational work that goes into connecting evidence and decision-making in the first place. So I think this is something that, to me, could be like one of the most important points that can serve decision makers by using living synthesis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniela. I think that's a really important point about living evidence sort of mapping movements and changes over time and how important that is to decision making. Thank you. I'm going to hand it finally the same question over to Rasha. You work at the intersection of sort of the methodological and the evidence-informed decision-making side. So over to you for your perspective on this.
Thank you, Shivit, and hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining today's panelists. So I have to say that my colleagues have covered many of the points that I would like to cover. So I'm going to be a bit brief. So as you have said, I work at the intersection between policy and decision making. So we work with policymakers, and as many of you know, decision makers, they often operate in contexts characterized by uncertainty, timeliness. Decisions need to be taken yesterday, rapid changes. So I can certainly, yes, living synthesis can increase trust, relevance, validity, and responsiveness in decision-making processes. And I can think of 3 ways that this can be achieved. So first of all, they can reduce the risk of policymakers and decision makers relying on evidence that is no longer sufficiently current, because one of the main premise of living synthesis is that they provide a systematic mechanism for ensuring that decisions are informed by the most current evidence. So it has to be explicitly predetermined, the frequency of search and the frequency of updating the review, so that decision makers are aware of what to expect. Second, I believe that living synthesis, they reduce avoidable blind spots in decisions by remaining connected to an ongoing decision need. So in the evidence to policy work, we know that decisions are rarely one-off events. So a policymaker might agree on a given policy option, but then decision makers may still ask, so should we continue? Should we scale? Are some populations being left behind? What are the costs? Are there unintended consequences? So when we have living synthesis, particularly living evaluation synthesis, that remain connected to the decision making, this will help address some of those emerging questions as they come, because you are connected to the decision and it's not just a one-time thing or one-time connection with your policymaker. And thirdly, I think one of the critical strengths of living synthesis is that they signal to the decision makers when the evidence has changed enough to matter for them. And this is very important because it responds to decision makers' need for interpretation and not information overload. So because many people think that a living synthesis is, yes, okay, there's a new evidence, new data coming. We need to alert our policymakers about every single new study. This is overwhelming and this can create noise for the policymaker. So the strength of the living synthesis approach is that it shows clearly what has changed, why this matter, and most importantly, what is the implication for the policymaker and decision making, meaning whether actions should be reconsidered, should they require a different decision, should they come with a different policy. So the implication is very important. And this is what makes living synthesis a very important approach, because it enhances the usability, reliability, and efficiency of the decision-making process. So I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Rasha. Yeah, some really good perspectives there on how decision makers can be better served. I'm going to move on to the next question. And this is what can the UN and external evidence communities learn from each other on living syntheses? So hopefully there are some perspectives on this. We've had perspectives from the global evidence community and from within the UN community as well. So I'm going to open this question up to Ja-Eun first. You covered some of this in your presentation, but perhaps you have some additional points to mention. I'm going to put you on the spot here a bit, see if you can come up with some further points on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shiv. Yeah, I think this exchange is really valuable because this is like where actually both sides learn from each other. So I think this is like starting point. In my opinion, for the UN, we can learn from external evaluation communities, academia, particularly health sector. We can learn from, multi-year experience of a living synthesis, living evidence, and particularly, in my opinion, methodological rigor and transparent pipelines and reproducible workflow, and cutting-edge technology use, including machine learning. And particularly based on what Ruth presented, Alive did a really good job in terms of a systematic approach of building evidence, living evidence, from which we can really learn. And then also I was quite impressed by the documentation of living evidence impact on decision making. And I think it's really important for us to document how this living evidence impact, what we do. So I would say like those things really popped up in my mind when I heard panelists and Ruth presented. And then on the other side, I believe UN can contribute to the wider community with our experience, so with a complexity-aware synthesis. Then lots of panelists already mentioned that organizations and academia are trying to serve policymakers who are working in a very complex environment. Many UN evaluations already operate in this complex context, characterized by multi-level governance, humanitarian crisis, system change, and complex causal pathway. And we are often synthesizing evidence where attribution is really difficult and contexts are highly variable, and qualitative insights are just as important as quantitative findings. And then second, contribution from UN that is, in my opinion, is our strong focus on decision making. I mean, living evidence, the whole purpose of living evidence is, supporting decision making based on, in this like rapid evolving environment. So UN evaluations are closely linked to programming, strategy planning, policy dialogue, and accountability processes. As a result, we have a considerable experience of translating evidence into actionable insights for different users. And then lastly, we also have experience integrating diverse forms of evidence. Evaluation synthesizes in the UN often bring together qualitative, quantitative, participatory, normative, policy and implementation evidence within a single framework. So this is an area where evaluation practice has developed useful approaches that may be relevant beyond the UN system. And then I'm very encouraged by this initiative and hope this two groups meet together and then exchange our experiences more often. And also I was very encouraged by your initiatives such as an ASIC, which brings together different evidence communities around the shared goals. We often talked about interoperability across UN agencies, but I believe the future will involve something even broader, interoperability across sectors, disciplines, and different evidence ecosystems. Yeah, over.
Thank you very much, Ja-Eun. I'm going to move on to another question and see if we can get some different perspectives on this. So the question is, what does it or what would it take to move from one-off evidence products to evidence systems that remain current, trusted, and useful. So in many ways, this question speaks to the reason why we're holding this webinar. I'm going to hand it over to Fermia first, because you mentioned in your previous input that we're still navigating this process, and you have this perspective from a kind of regional evidence overview. So perhaps you can talk about some of the things you're doing to kind of navigate this process and install a sort of living evidence approach at your end.
Yeah, thank you, Shiv. Yes, I also think this is a very important question, because it's the center of what we're talking about, really. And I think, you know, bringing about or moving from a one-off evidence product to a system is going to be a sort of a mirrored sort of experience that we've had in the EIDM, a one-off reports that we've had in the past, and not even, having the living syntheses concept. And it's a similar sort of challenge, it's a similar area of navigation that we're trying to bring in. And I want to start by saying, it is one thing to have products and producing products and providing it to decision makers, but it's a whole another process when you're thinking about bringing this to an evidence system. And sustainability at the end of the day would really rely on how we work towards becoming or bringing these products to go into building the system. And the heart, I would say, is around designing and working everything by thinking or by putting at the back of our minds what are the needs of the users. So the users in this case could be researchers, evaluators, it could be practitioners and community at large, and having the needs of those users at the heart of the design. And as I mentioned earlier, and has been presented as well, living evidence, or the system that we're talking about now, is something that needs infrastructure, that needs governance, it needs sustainable funding. It's one of the challenges that we hear being raised and has been discussed earlier as well. And in addition to that, we need to bring in a strong partnership. And for this to work, again, as based on my experience working in national and regional systems, one of the pillars is bringing about trust between the producers and the users and everyone in between. And for this to work and for the trust to come, one of the things that we have to do, especially from evaluators and synthesizers' perspective, is bringing about transparency about the methods that go into the living syntheses, about what it means to update. Rasha was mentioning about, updating. It's not just about, telling our decision makers that we have evidence. It's about interpreting that. But at the same time, we need to be frank about what are the advantages of this, but what are the drawbacks as well. And being open and, putting that in as much as possible in a transparent way to have the discourse in there. But at the end of the day, ultimately, for us to move from one-off evidence product to evidence system, I've mentioned it before, but I will stress that it is about designing the system around evidence users. And the goal should be for us to have a system that is responsive for the different decision makers that I have mentioned earlier, and to put in there a continuous platform for learning, that as we are doing with the live learning forum, and ensuring that the evidence really remains current as much as possible, because that is the base of the living evidence, and trusted and also useful. And the usefulness, again, goes into focusing on designing around users' needs. And one of the examples that I can give you is the living evidence that we're working on, which is on HPV provision and the different strategies that we can use. And one of the pillars that we are putting in that is making sure that every single stakeholder is represented in that, and allowing decision makers and users to really have an input on how the design, how the living evidence is really being done, and what of that process makes sense or not. So that would allow us to really listen throughout the process of what is making sense and not just waiting, to provide what we have at the end of the day and have that feedback at the end and not throughout the process. So just to sum it up, I would say it's all about designing around user needs, but at the same time, we need that investment for us to move from one-off evidence to an evidence system and an ecosystem. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Some really interesting experiences and examples there. I'm going to hand it over to Rasha. Do you have a perspective on this in terms of what does it take to move from a one-off evidence product to an evidence system, a living evidence system? Over to you.
Thanks. And so certainly I echo what Fermia have mentioned. So basically what we're talking about is the shift from producing episodic evidence to stewarding an evidence to decision relationship over time. This is the shift that we want. And I believe that if we want to achieve that, this requires both a shift in mindset as well as institutional changes. And I like to also think about the goal. So our goal is to have this living evidence system embedded within decision support systems for policymaking. This is the ultimate aim. We want it to become embedded and to be part of the routine decision support system, right? So when we talk about the mindset, so I think we need 3 shifts. First of all, when we conceptualize evidence synthesis, so we need to stop thinking of it as a product and to move to thinking of it as a continuous process built around a question of interest or a question that is priority to decision makers, and no longer around a small team that independently comes together to answer a specific question at a single point of time and then disappear. So our conceptualization of evidence synthesis has to change to become a continuous process built around priority questions. Secondly, we need to rethink our expectations when it comes to what constitutes evidence or good enough thorough evidence when it comes to living modality. And one way to do that might be to consider living synthesis as an ongoing product in a process of continuous extension and improvement over time, because this would allow us to have the best possible synthesis at all time rather than having just one final or finished product that is valid at a single point in time only. So we need to rethink what's a good enough evidence at a given point in time when it comes to living modality. And thirdly, we need to acknowledge that, because often when we talk about the evidence ecosystem, people tend to think it's always evidence synthesis. We need to acknowledge that evidence synthesis is just one type of evidence within that broader evidence system or evidence ecosystem that also includes other types of studies like research, like primary research, evaluation, modelings, etc., which should all come together to effectively and efficiently inform decisions. So these are the 3 main mindset shifts that are needed. Moving into institutional changes, so I certainly agree with Fermia when she mentioned about the need for infrastructure, the need for strong governance, but I also want to emphasize about partnerships. So Fermia touched upon it, but for me, it's important to break the silos and build connection and foster trusted relationship between the different players in that evidence ecosystem. Currently, if we look at the reality, evidence generation, evidence synthesis, and decision-making are too disconnected. So you have the evaluations being completed in one stream, you have the synthesis produced in another, you have decisions taken elsewhere. So a living evidence ecosystem should bring these communities and connect them around priority topics and areas over time. So the silo is also, it's not only between the producers and users, it's also within the producers themselves. And an excellent example is what we are doing today. So unfortunately, the evidence synthesis community and the evidence evaluation are still disconnected. And we know that if we want to truly inform decisions on an ongoing basis, we need to link evidence synthesis with evaluation and not have evaluation come as an afterthought. And this is also something we are working with WHO around the establishment of a coalition for evidence that brings the different producers and the different users of evidence under one umbrella. So I think this is a very important point to keep in mind. And I also want to mention about incentives, because if we really want to have institutional changes, we cannot have it without changing the incentive systems, thinking about the mechanism of funding, the institutional mandates for living evidence system, the reward and recognition for the people and the partners that will be established in order for us to sustain the efforts over time. So I just wanted to add these additional thoughts to the table, and happy to see what other colleagues would add as well.
Thank you, Rasha. Thank you all panelists for answering those questions. I think we're going to move over to Q&A if that's okay. We have about 10 minutes left, and I see a few questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to try and direct this to the best of my abilities amongst the panelists. Let's see how I do. I can see that Ruth has been busy in the background answering lots of the questions on Q&A, but perhaps we can come back to some of these. I'm seeing one on from Arike Joel Bundro. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. So it's a question about whether living synthesis is universal or whether each individual culture has its own approach to living synthesis. So there's an initial response from Ruth there. But I thought, Josephine, you might have a perspective on this, because you spoke in your previous input about different formats and different approaches and how this is received by the decision makers that you're working with. So perhaps you have opinion on whether different cultures or different audiences need living evidence in different ways. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So, yes, the aspect of context really matters, and the sensitivity to cultures is also very important when you're dealing with living evidence. And that's why you see that we are having a big discussion now, for example, talking about Made in Africa evaluation. The way different communities, we're also having conversations on indigenous. So the way different systems operated across the globe, it matters. There are others that prefer just a conversation, a round table. There are others that prefer a formality where you're coming to do a whole full kind of presentation. So it's important for us to be sensitive on who we are dealing with. For example, when you're dealing with members of parliament, they really don't have a lot of time. You can't get them a report of 10 pages, even if it is beautiful as you may think. You can only direct your good ideas in one pager and quickly get their attention. So it's important for us to look at the context and then the culture that governs how evidence is received and utilized within that context that we're operating in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josephine. I see another open question here. This is specific to the UNEG, the UNEG synthesis working group. So, Ja-Eun, over to you on this one. To what extent is the working group helping to coordinate synthesis plans across UN institutions?
Honestly, Shiv, I think you can answer better. As I just started this co-chairship this year. However, based on my observation last year, Shiv, please add your experience for sure. We try to actually provide guidelines and the extensive guidelines that was put together by UNEG synthesis group, so that all the UN members, not only UN members, but external partners and different communities that can tap into what we have. And I also believe Shiv and Ross and Judith, the previous co-chairs, you try to have lots of different webinars and places where we can share experiences and learn from also external communities. So it's a voluntary membership. So I think the difficulty is that to ask for members time to put things together and then create the space where I share the experience. It's extremely difficult because we have a full-time job, and on top of that we are trying to do extra work to share. Yeah, I will hand it over to Shiva because you have more experience on this.
No, I agree with what you said. It's an informal coordination, but it is a forum for coordination all the same, given all the caveats you've put. I'm gonna go to one of the answered questions, if that's okay. I know Ruth has already had a go at this, so Ruth, maybe I'll bring you back in if that's all right. So there's a question here from an anonymous about what the best practices are on multi-stakeholder partnerships that you can share. I think that's an important question, and also kind of reinforces what you presented on. So over to you for a quick response on that, please.
Thank you so much. I think my short answer would be that we don't do statistics or complex meta-analysis or synthesis without experts. And there are experts and there are established practices for building good partnerships and co-production and working together in strong collaborations. So, of course, there's some tips and tricks that I could share and that others could share from this group, this amazing panel of people who are very committed to partnerships. But I think my short answer would be to really lean into this as not just as a nice to have, but as a really quite a specialist area and an area that deserves real attention. Thank you, Shiv. I see you're on mute, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, thank you so much. It's good. It's a good job I left that till the end of the webinar to make that mistake, and I didn't make it earlier. I don't see any other open questions. If the team behind the scenes wants to help me out here in case there's something I've missed, or if any of the panelists want to come in with a final word before we wrap up, I'm open to do that. Otherwise, we can end on a high, perhaps. Okay, I think we're going to head towards a wrap up because the end of this session is at 1:15. So I just wanted to thank all of our speakers, our panelists, all of our participants who attended, and those who asked questions in particular. Just a few summary points from me before we close the line. So first, living evidence is not just an updated report. All of the speakers and panelists have emphasized that it's a way of organizing evidence systems so that new evidence can be identified and communicated in ways that are timely and useful. Secondly, many of our panelists reinforce this point that evidence needs to be driven by real decision needs. And that kind of highlights the importance of linking living evidence to clear decision cycles, clear users, and mechanisms for acting on updates. Thirdly, and maybe the final point here is that evaluation synthesis has much to contribute to this agenda. Evaluations bring evidence on implementation, context, contribution, equity, organizational performance, and institutional learning. So it's important that these evaluations are considered as part of the evidence base for living evidence efforts in particular. Maybe I'll just add a final point, actually. There are practical challenges in this, and that's why it's so important that the likes of Alive are around. I think Ja-Eun highlighted that there are challenges around keeping evidence living regarding infrastructure, standards, governance, quality assurance, resourcing, and also careful use of AI. So we need to work together. And I hope that the UN evaluation community and Alive will continue working together on this, particularly in terms of the guidance that we're looking to develop. And also the other way around as well. Ruth, you highlighted how important the evaluation corpus is to the global evidence base for this. So let's continue working together, let's continue talking, and let's continue improving what we're doing. And with that, I think I'll call it an end to the session. Thank you again, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the rest of G Local and the rest of your day. Take care and watch this space.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.